So continuing on with step 2 of my paraphrasing technique, talk to yourself. Remember not to look at the original passage that you're trying to paraphrase, and just kind of think out loud about what you think the author was trying to say. Now, if you feel too goofy doing it out loud, then just go ahead and free write it. Just kind of scribble something down, but it can be real informal at this stage. Just talk yourself through what you've just read. Step 3 is now we're going to try paraphrasing. Now remember, don't look at the original passage, but you're just going to pretend that this is something interesting that you read and you're going to tell your friend about it. And if the first draft of it is a little too informal, you can clean up the language and make it a little more formal later, but just get the idea out there. How would you tell me about it if we were talking on the elevator? So express the idea in your own way. Again, paraphrasing is not about changing a few words around or just simply changing sentence structure around. That's the wrong way to think of it. If you think of it that way, you're going to accidentally plagiarize. So instead, just look at it as, oh, I just read this interesting thing and I'm going to share it with my readers. Step 4, now you're going to check yourself. So now you can look again at the original passage and check what you've just written against the original author's wording. Now, you may sometimes find that you're still sticking too closely to the original wording, and in that case, repeat the same steps again. Sometimes it takes a few tries. If you try it 2 or 3 times and you just really can't do it, sometimes there are certain passages that are just too tough to paraphrase, and that might be a good time to use a quotation. For example, sentences with a lot of lists can be difficult to paraphrase. Sentences with a lot of numbers or statistics in them can sometimes be difficult to paraphrase. But always try these steps first, and then if you just can't seem to do it, then maybe consider using a quotation. And if you follow this 4-step process, I think you're going to find that paraphrasing gets a lot easier and a lot less intimidating. So I have a blog, as some of you may know. It's called Whitney's Writing Tips, or Writing Tip of the Week, actually, I think is the name of the blog itself. So have a look at my blog, and I've got all of this there, and I've got an example for you to look at as well. Check out my blog. So let's talk about some do's and don'ts of avoiding accidental plagiarism by paraphrasing. So the examples that I'm going to show you are not my own. They're from a terrific handout from the University of Texas at Austin's website, and there's the URL for that if you're interested in looking at it. There are 2 wrong ways to paraphrase. The first one is simply to fail to cite the source. So even if you paraphrase beautifully and you actually have done a really good job of expressing this idea in your own words, if you don't include a citation, you're plagiarizing. The second wrong way to paraphrase is sticking too closely to the original author's wording, and that's the mistake that we just talked about how to avoid with the 4-step process. Let's just look at a quick example of that. So I don't think I even have to read this to you. If you just look at the original passage and then you look at what I've highlighted in red, what I've highlighted in red here is either very close to or identical to the original source wording. There's just a couple of little things changed. And I'll just give you a minute to look at this. And you can pause the video as well, but this is a terrible paraphrase and definitely is plagiarism. Now note that the author does cite the source, but the author is using exact wording without using any quotation marks or block quote formatting to indicate that this is a quote, so this is absolutely plagiarism. Now let's look at another example. This is going to be 3 sample paraphrases of the same passage, and we're going to decide which of these, if any, are properly paraphrased and which, if any, are plagiarized or partially plagiarized. Now these examples are from a handout from the Writing Center at Northern State University, except for the last one, which is my own, because I thought that theirs was still not ideal, so I actually rewrote it myself. So number 3 is mine. So here's the original passage, and this is from a book by Masters, Johnson, and Kolodny, who some of you may remember were the famous sex researchers back in the 80s and 90s. In the past 25 years, there has been considerable scientific interest in studying differences and similarities between the sexes for a number of reasons. First, various beliefs about sex differences in traits, talents, and temperaments have greatly influenced social, political, and economic systems throughout history. Second, recent trends have threatened age-old distinctions between the sexes. In 1987, for instance, more than half of American women worked outside the home. Unisex fashions in hairstyles, clothing, and jewelry are now popular. Even anatomic status is not fixed in a day when change of sex surgery is possible. Third, the feminist movement has brought increasing attention to areas of sex discrimination and sexism and has demanded sexual equality. Okay, so that is the original passage. Let's look at attempt 1. In the past 25 years, scientists have been interested in studying differences and similarities between the sexes. There are many reasons for this. First, many beliefs about sex differences in traits, talents, and temperaments have had an effect on societies, politics, and economies throughout the world. Second, current trends have challenged age-old distinctions between the sexes. For example, in 1987, more than half of American women worked outside the home. Also, unisex fashions are now popular. People can even have sex change operations. Finally, the women's movement has brought more attention to things like sex discrimination and sexism and has argued for sexual equality. So here I have highlighted in red, and it's kind of difficult to do this in the PowerPoint format because you can't see both of them right next to each other. So I've highlighted in red the areas that are very similar or identical. And let's go back here if I can figure out how to do that. For some reason, the software I'm using, here we go. So we've got in the past 25 years is identical. Considerable scientific interest in studying differences and similarities between the sexes for a number of reasons. Interested in studying differences and similarities between the sexes, that's identical. They've made for a number of reasons into a separate sentence. There are many reasons for this, which is fine. And now we've got beliefs about sex differences and traits, talents, and temperaments have had an effect on societies, politics, and economies throughout the world. Let's look at the original on that. So we've got sex differences and traits, talents, and temperaments. That's identical. And then they've turned social, political, and economic systems throughout history into societies, politics, and economies, I believe, yeah, throughout the world. So very similar. And that, by the way, is one of those sentences that I mentioned a minute ago that might be hard to paraphrase because it's full of lists. So we've got traits, talents, and temperaments, societies, politics, and economies. That can be difficult to paraphrase. And you can see there's a lot of other things too. And also note that there is no citation. So this one is plagiarized out the yin-yang, no good. Let's look at attempt 2. We have a citation, so that's a little bit better right at the get-go. Scientists have been interested in comparing and contrasting the sexes for at least 25 years. 3 primary reasons explain this. First, many beliefs about sex differences in traits, talents, and temperaments have had an effect on societies, politics, and economies throughout the world. Second, established differences between the sexes have been challenged by current trends. For example, in 1987, more than half of American women worked outside the home. Also, unisex fashions are now popular. People can even have sex change operations. Finally, the women's movement has led to increased awareness of sex discrimination, sexism, and sexual equality. Citation. All right, so we're getting a little bit better. We've got a citation, but we still got that troublesome sentence there with traits, talents, and temperaments, societies, politics, and economies. Much too close in part and identical in part as well. And so I've highlighted in red here everything that is either identical or so close as to be in the plagiarism zone. So still not great. I would still probably have a problem with this paraphrase. Now let's look at number 3. Scientists have been interested in comparing and contrasting men and women for nearly 3 decades, and 3 primary reasons explain this interest. First, as Masters Johnson and Kolodny explain, quote, various beliefs about sex differences in traits, talents, and temperaments have greatly influenced social, political, and economic systems throughout history. In addition, long-held beliefs about gender have been challenged by current trends such as unisex fashions, women in the workforce, and sex reassignment surgeries. Finally, the women's movement has brought the issues of sex discrimination and gender inequality into the public spotlight. Okay, so obviously this one is the good one. We've got our citation. Note that the troublesome sentence is just quoted in this example. And we've also got, let's go back to the original text. So we've got, instead of 25 years, we've got nearly 3 decades. we've got instead of between the sexes, we've got men and women, right? We've got a couple of different sentences down here about the feminist movement, change of sex surgery, and unisex fashions all becoming one sentence, which also you'll find in a good paraphrase is often more concise than the original. So see, we've got long-held beliefs about gender have been challenged by current trends such as unisex fashions, women in the workforce, and sex reassignment surgeries. So we've kind of got a lot crammed into that one little sentence there. So this is the one that I think would represent a good paraphrase. And you may want to take some time and go back and look at these again when you finish watching this video. So the only thing that's identical or even really close to the original is the quote in that example, which is fine. So we already went through this. I don't really need to go over that with you. So above all, remember that your sources are tools. They're not there to say what you want to say for you. They're there to help you say what you want to say. And that is a really important sea change in the way a lot of people view source material. They're not there to make the point for you. They're there to help you make your point. And you have to do the hard work of critical thinking to connect the dots, connect the threads, and bring out the big picture so that the reader can understand what your point is and then how the quotations and statistics and examples you're drawing from the sources support and develop and give examples of that point that you're trying to make. So I told you about my blog, Writing Tip of the Week at blogspot.com. There is a blog post on this that goes into some of this in a little more detail. And I hope you've enjoyed this. And everybody have a great day. Bye-bye.